Ontario is enormous. Most people immediately think of Toronto or Ottawa, yet the province stretches across more than 1 million square kilometers, and a vast portion of that landscape is nothing but rugged rock and endless forest. From the middle of the 19th century through the early decades of the 20th, prospectors, loggers, and settlers pushed deep into these remote regions in search of gold, silver, and valuable timber. In places that were incredibly difficult to access, they established hundreds of small communities. Today, historians estimate that over 400 ghost towns are scattered throughout Ontario's wilderness. Some faded away simply because the resources disappeared, but others left behind stories that seem pulled straight from a strange novel. We are exploring settlements with names that sound almost unbelievable, and locations so remote that reaching them often means trekking through miles of dense boreal forest. If you enjoy these deep explorations of forgotten history, be sure to subscribe because it helps keep stories like these alive. And stay with us until the #1 spot, where we uncover the story of Silver Islet, an industrial dream that ultimately vanished beneath the icy waters of Lake Superior. It is a tale of extreme isolation that may completely change how you think about what people can build in the middle of nowhere. Is Swastika. If you travel toward Kirkland Lake in northern Ontario, you will come across a town name that usually causes visitors to pause for a second look. Swastika is easily one of the most controversial names found on a Canadian map, yet its history predates the modern meaning associated with the word. In 1908, two brothers, James and Bill Dusty, were searching for gold along the Blanche River. After discovering a promising vein, they named their mining claim after the ancient Sanskrit symbol that represented good fortune. At the time, the symbol was widely used on everything from greeting cards to sports uniforms, so nobody thought much of it. The discovery attracted attention quickly because the gold deposits were genuine. By the 1920s, Swastika had become an important center for the surrounding area. The town featured a railway station, multiple hotels, a school, and a functioning post office. It was a thriving community where families built their lives, and many believed it had a permanent future. Everything changed during the Second World War. Provincial officials attempted to rename the community Winston in honor of Winston Churchill, hoping to avoid any association with Nazi Germany. The residents refused to accept the change. They famously removed the replacement signs and restored the original ones, insisting that the town had carried the name long before the Nazis existed. To them, the name represented their local history, not politics overseas. Eventually, the gold became more difficult to extract, and major mining operations shifted toward nearby Kirkland Lake. As employment opportunities moved, residents followed. The community gradually lost population and entered a long decline. Today, Swastika is not completely abandoned, but it is only a shadow of its former self. Some mining foundations remain, and the original railway station still stands, while the surrounding forest slowly reclaims everything else. Number 9 is Balaclava. Hidden within Renfrew County, roughly 90 minutes west of Ottawa, lie the remains of a settlement known as Balaclava. The community was named after the famous Crimean War battle, following a common naming trend among Ontario towns during the 19th century. The village was carved directly out of dense woodland to support a major sawmill operation situated beside Constant Creek. It was a rugged and energetic place, where the noise of cutting timber echoed almost constantly. During the late 1800s, Balaclava served as a critical center for the local logging industry. The settlement included a general store, a blacksmith shop, a school, and even a hotel that welcomed passing loggers. The sawmill itself dominated the landscape. Built primarily from wood, it provided steady employment for dozens of families living in this isolated corner of the province. However, forestry has always been a risky business. By the beginning of the 20th century, much of the region's best white pine had already been harvested. As timber quality declined and transportation expenses increased, profits became harder to maintain. A fire eventually damaged portions of the operation, and ownership concluded that rebuilding everything would be too expensive. The decline started gradually but accelerated quickly. Families left in search of opportunities elsewhere, while abandoned structures slowly deteriorated under Ontario's harsh climate. Today, Balaclava attracts photographers who come to document the remains of the old mill. Most of the roof has collapsed, and the machinery has long since rusted into place, yet the size of the ruins still hints at the wealth that once flowed through this creek. It feels isolated, silent, and strangely disconnected from modern life. At the far end of the Sibley Peninsula on Lake Superior sits a place that feels like the edge of civilization itself. Number 8 is Silver Islet was more than just a mining town. It was an audacious challenge to one of the most powerful lakes on Earth. In 1868, surveyors discovered a rich silver deposit on a tiny rocky outcrop no larger than a ballroom. The rock sat nearly a mile offshore in the dangerous waters of Lake Superior. To access the ore, workers constructed an enormous breakwater using timber and stone, protecting the site from waves that could easily sweep miners into the freezing lake. In essence, they transformed a small rock into a man-made island. At its height, Silver Islet operated as the richest silver mine in the world. On the mainland, a settlement of more than 600 people developed around the operation. Most residents were miners and their families living in modest company housing. Because of the town's extreme isolation, the company built a large general store, which still survives today, and served as the social center of the community. Daily life was a non-stop battle against nature. Mine shafts eventually extended more than 1,200 feet underground, placing workers far below the floor of Lake Superior itself. Huge steam-powered pumps operated around the clock, removing water that constantly leaked through cracks in the surrounding rock. If the pumps ever stopped functioning, the mine could flood within minutes. That nightmare became reality in 1884. During a severe winter storm, a vessel carrying a critical shipment of coal became trapped in the ice and never reached its destination. Without fuel, the boilers went cold, and the pumps slowly shut down. The miners could do nothing but watch as water poured into the shafts, permanently flooding the mine and burying both the machinery and the remaining silver beneath the lake. The town's decline was almost immediate. Today, the island is little more than a windswept concrete platform. Looking through the remarkably clear water, visitors can still see the timber structures that once supported the mine shafts, serving as a silent reminder of the day Lake Superior finally defeated human ambition. Deep within the rugged hills of eastern Ontario lies another settlement, whose memorable name has helped preserve its story. Number 7 is Crooked Lake was never a major city, but it played an important role for logging crews who spent winters harvesting the region's dense pine and spruce forests. The name comes directly from the shape of the lake itself, which twists through the landscape like a giant fork. Geography dictated nearly every aspect of life there. The community grew from hard work in the timber trade, with modest wooden cabins lining the rocky shoreline. During the height of the logging boom, Crooked Lake maintained a school and a small post office that connected residents to the outside world. It was a self-contained community where the arrival of supplies could become the biggest event of an entire month. Isolation was simply part of life, and the people who remained there earned a reputation for toughness throughout the province. Yet eventually the forest had little left to offer. By the middle of the 20th century, most of the valuable timber had been harvested, and logging companies moved their operations farther north. Without the industry that sustained it, Crooked Lake quickly lost its reason to exist. Families relocated closer to major roads and towns, leaving cabins exposed to decades of heavy snowfall and neglect. Today, the location has been largely reclaimed by the boreal forest. Hikers occasionally discover rusted stoves, scattered tools, or piles of decaying cedar logs. The settlement itself has almost vanished beneath the landscape. What remains is a quiet memorial to an industry that once shaped the entire region. We have already explored several unusual places, but we are only about halfway through our journey. If you have ever come across an abandoned structure or an oddly named location while traveling Ontario's backroads, share it in the comments. Stories from viewers often lead us to fascinating places we might never have discovered otherwise. And if you are enjoying these historical explorations, consider leaving a like so more people can discover these forgotten corners of the province. If you travel through the rolling agricultural landscape of southwestern Ontario, where Perth, Oxford, and Waterloo counties meet, you will encounter a place with a name that sounds almost too strange to be real. Number 6 is Punky Doodle's Corner. Punky Doodle's Corner has been a legendary landmark in local history for well over a century. Unlike the remote mining camps scattered across northern Ontario, this community grew out of the region's agricultural prosperity. According to one local story, the unusual name originated from a tavern owner who constantly sang a nonsense tune while working. Another version claims it came from a pumpkin farmer, whose personality earned him the nickname Punky Doodle. Whatever the true origin may be, the name gave the crossroads a memorable identity that survived long after most of the original buildings disappeared. During its peak in the late 19th century, this was far more than a curious name on a map. It served as an important gathering place for farmers throughout the surrounding countryside. The intersection featured a thriving general store, a blacksmith shop, and a tavern that functioned as the unofficial meeting place for the area. Thanks to exceptionally fertile soil, the community avoided the sudden economic crashes that devastated many northern settlements. Instead, daily life followed the dependable cycle of planting and harvest seasons. It was a stable community where families often remained for generations. Its decline came not through disaster, but through gradual change. As automobiles became common and transportation improved, small crossroads businesses lost their importance. Residents began traveling directly to larger centers, such as Stratford and Kitchener, for shopping and services. Over time, stores closed one after another. Houses were either demolished or relocated, making room for additional farmland. By the middle of the 20th century, the settlement had effectively returned to open countryside. Today, the most recognizable feature is the famous road sign, which has been stolen so frequently by souvenir hunters that authorities have had to secure it with specialized hardware. It stands as a peculiar reminder that even long-established farming communities can slowly disappear as technology and lifestyles evolve. Moving north into the Almaguin Highlands, you enter an area that resembles a cemetery for ambitious Victorian-era settlement projects. The region surrounding Burke's Falls is unusual because it contains not one ghost town, but an entire collection of abandoned communities, including Seguin Falls, Mowat, and Swanson. These settlements emerged during a period when government officials were determined to expand settlement farther into northern Ontario. Free land was offered to anyone willing to clear forests and establish a farm. Thousands accepted the opportunity, arriving with little more than basic tools and hopes of building prosperous lives. For several decades, these villages flourished. The communities were connected by the winding routes of the Grand Trunk Railway, which delivered supplies and carried valuable timber out of the region. The towns possessed nearly every feature expected in a growing society. Large hotels with wraparound porches welcomed visitors, while schools educated local children. Because the settlements existed close to one another, residents felt they were participating in the creation of a permanent civilization deep within the wilderness. They were not merely surviving, they believed they were building the future. Unfortunately, the geography of the highlands eventually exposed a harsh reality. Once the forests had been cleared, settlers discovered that the soil beneath was thin, rocky, acidic, and poorly suited to farming. Massive glacial boulders covered much of the land. Growing enough grain to support a family proved difficult, while commercial agriculture was nearly impossible. When logging companies exhausted the surrounding forests, the region lost its primary source of income. The railway later redirected its major routes toward flatter terrain, isolating many of these communities from important markets. Abandonment occurred gradually. Businesses failed first. Post offices followed. Eventually, families left behind farms they had spent years carving from the wilderness. Today, the forests surrounding Burke's Falls contain countless reminders of those vanished settlements. Stone-lined cellar holes mark the locations where homes once stood. Wander far enough from the main trails, and you may discover former streets that now exist only as rows of maple trees and rusted fence lines. These communities represent both a policy failure and a misunderstanding of the landscape itself. They form a haunting reminder of what happens when optimism collides with the realities of the Canadian Shield. Some of Ontario's most heartbreaking examples of isolation can be found along the historic Opiongo line. Constructed during the 1850s, this colonization road extended from the Ottawa River deep into territory that now forms part of Algonquin Park. Government advertisements described the land along the route as some of the best farmland in Canada. The reality was very different. Settlers encountered rocky terrain, wetlands, and difficult conditions that made farming incredibly challenging. Number 4 is Opiongo line settlements. Communities such as Foymount, Brudenell, and Newfoundland were established by immigrants, many of whom were Irish families seeking a better future after the famine. Life along the Opiongo line demanded extraordinary resilience. Floods, snowstorms, and poor road conditions frequently cut villages off from the rest of the province for extended periods. Residents had little choice but to become self-sufficient. They built local mills, produced much of their own clothing, and relied heavily on their neighbors. In Newfoundland, the hillsides were so steep that local legends joked cows needed one pair of legs shorter than the other to stand properly. Whether true or not, the story captures the difficult conditions settlers faced. Daily life consisted of relentless labor combined with profound isolation. The eventual collapse of these communities was almost unavoidable. As children reached adulthood, many realized the rocky farms offered little opportunity. They left for industrial jobs in southern Ontario, leaving older generations behind. Modern highways eventually bypassed the original colonization road, reducing its importance even further. The settlements slowly faded into history. Today, travelers along the Opeongo line can still see remnants of those communities. Crumbling log cabins, leaning barns, and forgotten foundations remain scattered along stretches of gravel and cracked pavement. There is a unique heaviness to the silence in these places. They stand as monuments to a government project that encouraged settlement in unforgiving terrain, and then largely abandoned those communities once the region had been mapped and explored. Few stories illustrate isolation born from broken promises more clearly. Northern Ontario itself resembles a patchwork of abandoned dreams. Number 3 is Northern Ontario's mining ghost towns. Across the region, names such as Jackfish, Dieppe, and Goudreau appear on maps as reminders of once thriving communities. These settlements were not simple villages. They were ambitious urban experiments built in the middle of the Precambrian Shield. Whenever prospectors discovered valuable deposits of gold, silver, or cobalt, development occurred at astonishing speed. Within weeks, thousands of workers would arrive by train, followed by the machinery required to extract wealth from the ground. Mining settlements possessed an energy completely different from the slow decline seen in farming communities. Around places such as Cobalt and the Porcupine District, infrastructure often rivaled that of major cities. Electric streetlights illuminated roads, while many other regions of the country still relied on oil lamps. Professional hockey teams entertained residents, and theaters hosted regular performances. Life in these communities was both exciting and uncertain. Wages could be exceptional, but isolation remained ever present. Residents lived in pockets of prosperity, surrounded by enormous stretches of muskeg, forests, and wilderness. Because there were few alternatives for entertainment, social life became intense. Grand theaters, hotels, and opera houses appeared in places that were essentially built around a single mine shaft. Residents tried to create the atmosphere of established cities despite living atop a finite resource, and that resource ultimately determined their fate. Once a mine stopped producing profitable quantities of ore, the foundation of the entire community vanished. Towns that had grown rapidly could collapse with equal speed. When operations shut down in places like Jackfish, or when silver prices dropped dramatically on international markets, companies often responded by cutting services immediately. Power plants closed, jobs disappeared, and residents left almost overnight. A town of several thousand people could shrink to a few dozen inhabitants within weeks. Many residents abandoned furniture, equipment, and personal belongings because transporting them away cost more than they were worth. Today, the scale of what remains makes these places especially unsettling. A traveler may walk through dense forest and unexpectedly discover a large brick hospital, an abandoned hotel, or a concrete bank vault standing alone among the trees. These structures are architectural ghosts, evidence of how quickly an entire civilization can disappear when its survival depends on a single industry. If the mining communities were temporary cities, then the logging camps hidden deep within the boreal wilderness were more like stationary ships anchored in a sea of trees. Number 2 is remote logging camps. Located throughout the remote regions of Thunder Bay and Algoma, these camps represented the absolute edge of where people could endure life during the long northern winters. Unlike many of the settlements on this list, these sites were never meant to become permanent communities filled with families and future generations. They existed solely to support the relentless demand of the southern lumber and paper industries. A typical camp consisted of several long bunkhouses, a large cookhouse, storage sheds, and stables for the horses used to haul logs. During summer, access was usually limited to waterways, while winter travel depended on frozen roads stretching across lakes and muskeg. Few places in Canadian history were more isolated. The men who worked in these camps lived in a world almost completely separated from civilization. For months at a time, daily life revolved around the sound of axes, the scent of pine sap, and endless fields of snow. The isolation became so intense that it earned its own nickname among workers, bush madness. Because they operated far from government oversight and established towns, these camps developed their own rough systems and traditions. The company store often served as the only source of food, clothing, tobacco, and equipment. In many cases, workers depended entirely on the company throughout the season, creating a system that left them with very little freedom. When spring arrived and the logs were floated downstream toward the mills, the camps were shut down and abandoned until the next winter. Buildings were boarded up and left behind, as wildlife gradually reclaimed the surrounding forest. Eventually, technological advances changed the industry. Chainsaws, trucks, and heavy machinery drastically reduced the need for large crews living deep in the wilderness. Companies discovered they could accomplish the same work with far fewer people operating from mobile bases. One by one, the old logging camps disappeared. Unlike the brick buildings left behind by mining towns, these camps were constructed from materials that nature could easily reclaim. Finding one today often feels more like an archaeological exercise than a historical visit. Snow has collapsed roofs, moisture has rotted the timbers, and the forest floor has swallowed much of what once existed. Visitors occasionally stumble across rusted cans, broken tools, or scattered boot soles hidden beneath moss and leaves. In most cases, however, the forest has nearly completed its work. These camps were once among the most isolated workplaces in Ontario, and today they survive only as faint traces beneath the trees. The number one spot on our list takes us to a place where isolation was not simply a consequence of geography. It was the entire reason the community existed. Nichols Island sits quietly in the middle of the Rideau River, and for many years supported one of the most unusual and self-sufficient communities in Ontario. Unlike the mining camps and logging settlements that existed for profit, this was a tiny world created by people who deliberately chose to live apart from the mainland. The families who settled there built their own homes, produced nearly all of their own food, and created a way of life that functioned almost independently from the rest of the province. Access to the island depended on a small hand-operated ferry controlled entirely by the residents. If they chose not to run it, they could effectively cut themselves off from the outside world. At its height, Nichols Island stood as an extraordinary example of determination and self-reliance. The families who lived there endured harsh winters, seasonal floods, and countless hardships that would have convinced many others to leave. They repaired their own equipment, solved their own problems, and raised their children within the boundaries of a small patch of land surrounded by water. It was not a wealthy settlement or a booming industrial center. Instead, it represented a quieter kind of success. Generation after generation proved that a community could survive without major industries or large populations as long as its residents remained committed to one another. Yet even the strongest communities have limits. As time passed, the demands of maintaining such an isolated lifestyle became harder for younger generations to accept. Opportunities elsewhere made island life less attractive, and fewer people were willing to continue the sacrifices their parents and grandparents had made. As the older residents passed away, the community slowly weakened. The ferry began to fall into disrepair. Gardens that once supplied food became overgrown. Buildings received less maintenance and gradually started to deteriorate. Eventually, government authorities restricted permanent residency on the island and transformed it into a protected area. Today, paddlers traveling along the Rideau River can still see traces of the settlement. Collapsing porches lean toward the shoreline, and rusted pieces of the old ferry system remain scattered among the vegetation. What makes Nichols Island so haunting is what it represents. It was perhaps one of the closest examples Ontario ever had of a truly independent community, a place where people intentionally separated themselves from the mainland and managed to thrive for generations. Yet even here, geography eventually had the final say. The island stands as a reminder that, no matter how determined people may be, maintaining complete independence comes at a cost. Over time, nature, distance, and changing generations can erode even the strongest communities. Today, the remains of Nichols Island sit quietly along the river, slowly returning to the landscape around them. The gardens have faded, the ferry no longer runs, and the homes that once sheltered families are gradually being reclaimed by time. It is a fitting final entry on this list because it captures the central theme behind so many of Ontario's forgotten places. Whether they were built around silver, timber, farming, or self-sufficiency, each community was ultimately shaped by isolation. Some survived for decades. Others flourished only briefly. But all of them remind us how difficult it was to carve out a life in the vast wilderness of Ontario. If you paddle past Nichols Island today, you are not simply looking at abandoned buildings. You are looking at the remains of a dream built on independence, resilience, and the belief that people could create a world of their own. And for a time, they actually did. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more.